This week, what is the true state of free speech on university campuses, and are those attitudes bleeding out into the corporate world, particularly in progressive Silicon Valley? So I talk a lot about the stupidity taking place on college campuses, but is it all overblown? Isn't it just a noisy minority of mentally fragile children? Well, earlier in the week, the New York Times reported on a survey of over 3,000 college students' attitudes towards free speech. But let's avoid the New York Times and go directly to the source. Free expression on campus, what college students think about First Amendment issues. This is 46 pages long, so I'm just going to pull out the highlights as I see them. So compared to the previous year, students think all 5 First Amendment rights are less secure, especially freedom of the press. And this difference seems to be driven entirely by politics. As you can see from this chart, Republicans feel about the same as they did last year on the security of First Amendment rights, but Democrats' views have declined substantially. Independents have also declined, but to a lesser extent. And as I said previously, particularly with respect to freedom of the press. But I wonder if this is more perception than reality. No doubt Trump has made some threatening noises about the press. For example, before the election, he vowed to change libel laws to make it easier to win big lawsuits against media organisations. That never happened. After the election, he pressured the FBI director to consider sending reporters to jail for publishing classified information. That didn't happen either. And in October last year, Trump threatened NBC's license over a nuclear weapons report. That's not even possible under FCC rules, as the agency licenses individual stations and not networks. So whilst it might be disturbing to see a president attacking freedom of the press, has anything actually changed in a legal sense? I don't keep a close eye on such developments, but please let me know in the comments if something has actually changed. Moving on to what I think is the most important part of this survey, college students say both free speech rights and an inclusive society are highly important to democracy. 89% think protecting free speech rights is extremely or very important, and 83% think the same about promoting an inclusive society that welcomes diverse groups. However, when it comes to choosing which is more important, the majority believe a diverse and inclusive society is more important than free speech. And I think this is a good advertisement for why an understanding of history is important. History tells us that inclusion of so-called marginalised groups can only happen because they exercise their right to free speech in the first place. Freedom of speech is the right from which all other rights flow. Without it, you don't get diversity and inclusion. And of course, a lot turns on what is meant by diversity and inclusion, because what is often parroted as diverse and inclusive is often exclusive. And the breakdown here is interesting. The majority of men, 61%, say free speech is more important, whilst the majority of women, 64%, say diversity and inclusion. And that might help explain why women are overrepresented in the social justice crowd. Republicans favour free speech by more than 2-1, whilst it's the reverse for Democrats. I doubt that's particularly surprising to anyone at this stage. Now, on the positive side, the majority of students, 70%, prefer an open learning environment that allows offensive speech, as opposed to a positive environment that prohibits certain speech. But that has declined from the previous year, when 78% supported an open environment, so not moving in a positive direction. A majority in all groups support an open environment, but there is a significant difference between Republicans and Democrats. More disturbingly, most students don't think hate speech should be protected by the First Amendment, despite the Supreme Court upholding the view that hate speech is free speech. Even 52% of Republicans think it should not be protected. Drilling down, slightly more students in 2017 think slurs and intentionally offensive language should be restricted, but slightly less, although still a majority, think wearing costumes that stereotype racial or ethnic groups should be restricted. So the fun police still think Halloween and tequila nights are offensive. And a growing number think you should not be able to express political viewpoints that are upsetting or offensive, like the gender gauge rap is not real. Black students seem to be particularly censorious when it comes to these restrictions, and the same trend can be observed as in the previous questions. Women are more censorious than men, Democrats more so than Republicans. Now, there are people who don't understand or deliberately misunderstand when someone like myself says that hate speech should not be criminalised. That doesn't mean I'm for hate speech or condone it. I just don't think you should be punished for using it. The obvious problem is who is going to define what hate speech is, and then who's going to enforce it, because it's often the most easily offended and censorious deciding for the rest of us what is and isn't hate speech. In Australia, Canada and the UK, we do have hate speech laws, and they are overly restrictive. So I wish more American students appreciated just how important the First Amendment is. Moving on, 87% of students are in favour of the provision of safe spaces, 83% in support of a free speech zone, and approximately half are in favour of speech codes or codes of conduct. Now, I think it's sad that you need to designate a special area of campus for free speech, as though it's some kind of fringe activity. And what is a safe space exactly? Do you really need a special place to wallow in victimhood? Can't you just do that anywhere? I guess not. Now, this is an interesting result. The percentage of people that agree or strongly agree with the following statement: the climate on my campus prevents some people from saying things they believe because others might find them offensive. So again, the big split here seems to be a political one. Republicans and Democrats have basically swapped positions from the previous year. Now, perhaps this is a reflection of the election result, but it's somewhat ironic that Democrats feel more prevented from saying things when they are overwhelmingly more in favour of restricting people from saying things. Finally, more than 1/4 of students are in favour of disinviting speakers because some students are opposed to the invitation. 1/3 of women are in favour and almost 40% of Democrats, whilst only 20% of men and 11% of Republicans are in favour. So I think there's plenty to be disturbed about with regards to the attitudes of US college students, but how about the attitudes in the progressive haven that is Silicon Valley? This survey was commissioned by the Lincoln Group in reaction to the James Damore David Guterman lawsuit. So basically they surveyed 400 tech employees about how they perceive the industry's ideological openness. So they received 387 responses, 84% male, 13% female, and 3% other. And you can see some of the companies they work for, such as Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple. And there's a good spread across the political spectrum, the largest group identifying as libertarian. So to the first question, I know someone who did not pursue or left a career in tech because of perceived conflicts in viewpoints. Not surprisingly, libertarians and conservatives were about twice as likely to answer yes. One libertarian was quoted as saying, "I have lost multiple talented colleagues who resigned rather than continue in the face of an increasingly extreme, narrow-minded and regressive environment here at Google. It's terrifying here, a real horror show. Every day could be my last." Moving on, following the Google diversity memo and Google's response, conservatives, libertarians, and even moderates are more likely to say they are less comfortable sharing their ideological viewpoints with colleagues. One moderate commented, "When Damore presented his ideas for increasing female participation in tech, he precipitated an internal lynch mob at Google. The participants' behaviour was frightening. Some switch-flipped and they were acting like deranged lunatics, as if they had experienced terrible traumas instead of working at one of the richest and generous companies in the world." And it doesn't matter where you fall on the political spectrum, the vast majority think their workplaces are liberal to very liberal. Here's a quote from a liberal: "There are people who are looking for a reason to be offended, and any sort of disagreement would make them wonder if I'm a secret Trump supporter. The idea of 'I agree with you 90% is not enough. Yes, you must agree with everything I say or else you shall be cast out." Doesn't sound like a cult at all, does it? Next question. Again, libertarians and conservatives were more likely to say that their ideological views being at odds with their workplace norms affects their ability to do their best work. One conservative remarked, "Fortunately, the severe examples of this problem appear to be limited to the larger public firms, unlike my own, as they employ greater numbers of very young recent grads who are exhibiting this extreme political correctness, policing, and desire to invoke policing forces against others." And the last question asked, are you hesitant to be yourself at work? Well, clearly the 3% that don't know what gender they are must be. And again, libertarians and conservatives and even moderates are more likely to say so. This was a quote from a Liberal. The senior VP of HR in a company-wide meeting described the fact that Labor laws prohibit racial discrimination against white employees as idiocy. Yeah, that's exactly the type of person you want in HR making decisions about hiring people. Here's a comment from a moderate. Despite being a co-founder, I still feel uncomfortable talking about a wide range of topics. I fear that if my team knew about my politics, more than half would quit on the spot. That's a tolerant mob. This one from a C-level executive. As a woman, everyone assumed I voted for Hillary, and I didn't correct them otherwise. My family and I attended the inauguration, but I did not tell anyone at work that I was travelling to DC. Had they known I attended the inauguration, I would have been ridiculed and questioned. Well, that doesn't sound like a very inclusive environment, does it? Now, Silicon Valley may well be a progressive bubble, but the point of all this, as I've been saying for some time, is that social justice ideology is having an effect beyond universities. And the only antidote to that, I know, is to stand up and speak out against it. That may be tough if you're a conservative or libertarian trying to keep your job, or even a moderate, but the more you stay quiet, the worse it's going to get. Anyway, as usual, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.